The December air in Virginia was cold and sharp, the kind that bites at any exposed skin as the sun disappears. It was that quiet hour after dusk, where the sky is a deep purple and the world feels still. A man, a lieutenant in the United States Army, was driving home. He'd just finished his duties for the day at his post. He was tired, the good kind of tired that comes from a full day's work, and he was looking forward to getting home. He was behind the wheel of a new car, a Chevrolet Tahoe. It was a recent purchase, and because of that, it had temporary paper license plates taped securely in the back window. They were valid, they were legal, but in the low light of evening, they were just white rectangles. He was thinking about ordinary things. Maybe about what he might eat for dinner. Maybe about a phone call he needed to make. His mind was on the familiar road ahead, navigating by muscle memory. He was dressed in his Army uniform, the green service uniform, with the black fabric of his rank, a gold bar and a silver bar on his shoulders. He took pride in that uniform. It meant something. It represented service, discipline, and a code of conduct he lived by every day. About 20 miles from his home, on a stretch of road that was growing darker and less populated, he noticed the headlights behind him. They were close. Then they flashed into the bright, unmistakable red and blue of police lights. His heart did a little skip, a natural reaction anyone has when those lights appear. He checked his speed. He was sure he wasn't speeding. He checked his tags. They were there, temporary, but there. He signaled carefully and began to slow down, but he didn't stop right there on the dark, narrow shoulder. This decision, a simple one in his mind, was the spark. He wasn't trying to run. The thought never crossed his mind. His military training, his own common sense, screamed that stopping on a dark, lonely road at night was a bad idea. It was unsafe. For him and for the officer. He remembered his training about risk avoidance. So he made a calm, calculated choice. He lifted his hands off the wheel for a second, making them visible, and then placed them back at the 10 and 2 position. He drove slowly, deliberately, at about 5 miles per hour, looking for a safe, well-lit place. Just ahead, he saw the glow of a gas station. It was perfect. Bright, public, with cameras probably. A safe place for everyone involved. He put on his turn signal again, a clear communication of his intent, and gently guided the Tahoe into the gas station lot, coming to a full and complete stop next to a pump. He put the car in park. He rolled down his window. He kept both hands high on the steering wheel, in plain sight. He did everything by the book he knew from his own service. He took a deep breath. This would be a simple interaction, he told himself. A quick chat about the temporary tags, maybe. He'd show his military ID, his driver's license. It would be cleared up, and he'd be on his way. But in the police cruiser behind him, a different story was being written. The 2 officers had seen the temporary tag. They'd run the numbers through their computer. Sometimes, with new cars, the information can take a minute to populate in the system. When they didn't get an instant ping back, assumption was born. The driver wasn't stopping immediately. He was eluding. The slow, careful drive to the gas station wasn't seen as a search for safety. It was seen as a challenge, a defiance. The mindset in the cruiser shifted from a routine traffic stop to something more tense, more charged. Before the Army officer even had his window all the way down, the scene exploded into chaos. Both cruiser doors flew open. Boots hit the pavement hard. The younger of the 2 officers, his hand already on his holster, moved quickly. The other officer, a more experienced man, was right behind him. Their voices cut through the quiet evening, loud and commanding, but they were saying 2 different things at once. "Show me your hands." One yelled, "Keep your hands on the wheel." The other shouted almost simultaneously. The Army officer, his hands never leaving the top of the steering wheel, where they were clearly visible, tried to speak. His voice was calm, steady, the voice of someone used to maintaining control under pressure. "What's going on, sir?" he asked. The answer was a bark. "Get out of the vehicle. Step out of the car now." He didn't move. Not out of disobedience, but out of a deep, instinctual fear. The energy was all wrong. This wasn't procedure. This was chaos. He could see the anger, the tension in their stances. To get out now, into that maelstrom, felt like a terrible idea. "I'm not getting out," he said, his voice still remarkably even. He was stating a fact, not arguing. "Yes, you are," the officer snapped. "I'm honestly afraid to get out," the lieutenant said. It was a simple human admission, a statement of pure truth. The officer leaned closer, his face now near the window. "Yeah," he said, his voice low and hard. "You should be." In that moment, under the fluorescent glow of the gas station lights, with the hum of a cooler from inside the convenience store, the world shrank down to the space inside that car. The lieutenant's military training told him to comply with lawful orders. But every other instinct in his body, the human instinct for self-preservation, screamed that these were not lawful orders delivered with control. They were threats delivered in rage. He was trapped between his duty as a citizen and his duty to his own survival. He was a soldier who had sworn an oath to protect his country, and now he found himself needing protection from the very people sworn to protect his community. The irony was a cold, heavy stone in his stomach. The safe, well-lit place he had chosen suddenly felt like the most dangerous place on earth. The air in the car turned electric, thick with a danger you could almost taste. The lieutenant's hands were still up, high on the wheel, fingers spread wide. He could see the officer clearly now through the driver's side window. The man's face was tight, jaw clenched. His eyes weren't just doing a job. They were blazing. This wasn't about a traffic stop anymore. Something else was happening, something old and dark and terrible, and it was unfolding right here under the buzzing gas station lights. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer yelled again, his voice ragged at the edges. Spittle flew from his lips. The lieutenant's mind was racing, but his body was locked in place. His military training had drilled into him how to handle capture, how to handle an enemy. But this wasn't an enemy. This was a police officer in Windsor, Virginia. There was no protocol for this. All he had was his humanity, and right now it was screaming at him that getting out was a very bad idea. "I'm not getting out," he repeated, his voice steady but firm. It wasn't defiance. It was a statement of survival. "I'm honestly afraid to get out." The officer's response was immediate. "Yeah," he sneered, leaning in so close his breath fogged the glass. "You should be." Those 3 words hung in the air, freezing everything. They weren't a warning. They were a promise. In that moment, any trust that this might be resolved peacefully evaporated. The lieutenant felt a cold dread settle in his gut. He was trapped in a metal box, and the situation was spiraling away from any sense of reason. The other officer was circling the SUV like a shark, his hand on his gun, shouting more commands that overlapped and contradicted the first. Officers. It was a wall of noise designed to confuse and overwhelm. Then, the lead officer did something that made the lieutenant's blood turn to ice. He unholstered his pistol. It wasn't lowered. It wasn't at his side. In one smooth, terrible motion, he raised it, pointed it directly through the window, and aimed it right at the lieutenant's face. The dark eye of the barrel was all he could see. "Put your hands out the window." The officer with the gun roared, but if he did that, he'd have to take his hands off the wheel where they were visible. The command made no sense. It was a trap. "Keep your hands on the wheel." The second officer shouted from somewhere near the hood, paralyzed by the impossible choice and the weapon pointed at his head. The lieutenant stayed still. "My hands are on the wheel," he said, his voice straining now to be heard over their yelling. He was trying to be the calm in their storm, but the storm was winning. The officer with the gun didn't lower it. Not an inch. His finger was alongside the trigger guard. "You're going to get sprayed." He yelled, though he was holding a gun. Not pepper spray. The lieutenant's mind clung to procedure, to law, to anything solid. "I'm serving this country," he said, the words leaving his mouth almost as a plea for reason. "This is how I'm treated?" It was as if he hadn't spoken. The officer's world had narrowed to a single target. With his left hand, he fumbled for the canister of pepper spray on his belt. The gun in his right hand never wavered, never stopped pointing at the man's head. It was a stunning two-handed display of aggression. There was a loud click-hiss sound. A stream of orange chemical agent shot through the open window. The lieutenant had a split second to shut his eyes, but it was too late. The burning hit him like a white-hot slap. It wasn't just pain. It was a complete system failure. His eyes slammed shut, searing as if filled with ground glass. His nose and throat felt like they were on fire, every breath a scalding gasp. His skin screamed. He groaned, a raw, involuntary sound of agony. He couldn't see. The world was orange pain and darkness. He was blind and struggling to breathe in a car that now felt like an oven. "Get out of the car. Get out now." The voices were muffled, like he was underwater. He was disoriented, panicking. His hands flailed, hitting the gear shift, the console. He was trying to comply, but his body was in revolt. He couldn't find the door handle. The chemical fire was eating through his senses. Open the door. Unlock it. They screamed. Gasping, choking, he managed to hit the unlock button. The thunk of the locks disengaging was the loudest sound he'd ever heard. The driver's door was wrenched open from the outside. Rough hands grabbed at the uniform blouse he wore, the fabric of the service he was so proud of. They yanked him violently from the seat. His legs, uncooperative and weak, tangled. He fell hard onto the rough, cold pavement of the gas station. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. He was on his knees and forced onto his stomach. The sharp grit of the pavement pressed into his burning face. A knee landed in the middle of his back. His arms were wrenched behind him. The cold metal of handcuffs snapped around his wrists, too tight, biting into his skin. Throughout it all, he kept trying to communicate through the torture in his eyes and lungs. His voice was a ragged, wet cough. "I'm active duty military," he choked out. "I have not done anything wrong." The officer who had pointed the gun, who had sprayed him, was standing over him now. The lieutenant, his face pressed against the ground, could only see the man's boots. The officer's voice came down, not loud anymore, but slow and deliberate, each word dripping with a chilling menace. "Listen to me," the officer said, as if sharing a dark secret. "You should be. You're fixing to ride the lightning, son." The phrase meant nothing to the lieutenant in his agony and confusion, but it was an old Southern slang term. It meant execution. The electric chair. The officer was telling him, as he lay cuffed and blinded on the ground, that he was about to be killed. In that moment, something shifted. The violence of the physical struggle was over. Now, there was just the profound violence of those words. The lieutenant went still, not from compliance, but from a shock that cut through even the chemical fire. This was more than brutality. This was a performance of absolute power, and he was its prop. The well-lit, safe place he had chosen had become a stage for a nightmare. And he was the star, lying in the spotlight, unable to see a thing. The cold of the pavement seeped through the lieutenant's uniform, a sharp contrast to the chemical fire burning on his face. He was still on his stomach, hands cuffed painfully behind his back. Every breath was a ragged, wet struggle, like inhaling sandpaper and needles. His eyes were swollen shut, two pulsing knots of agony. The world was just sound, smell, and the rough texture of the ground beneath his cheek. He could hear the heavy breathing of the officers standing over him. He could hear the rustle of their gear. The gas station lights were just a dull, orange glow through his ruined eyelids. Then, a new sound. Boots scraping close to his head. It was the officer, the one who had pointed the gun and spoken those terrible words. A man knelt down. His voice, when it came, was different. It had lost some of its raw fury. Now it sounded almost conversational, which was somehow worse. "All right," the officer said, his tone shifting. "Let's get you up. Come on." The words were so bizarre, so disconnected from the violence of the last 2 minutes, that the lieutenant couldn't process them. One moment he was being told he was about to be executed. The next he was being helped up. Hands, the same hands that had yanked him from the car, now hooked under his arms and lifted him to his knees. He was unsteady, dizzy from the pain and the disorientation. Just sit here for a minute," the officer said, guiding him to sit back on his heels. The lieutenant's head hung low, chin to his chest. He couldn't see, but he could feel the attention on him. It was no longer the predatory focus of a hunt. It was something else awkward, assessing, maybe even a little worried. "Can you open your eyes for me?" the other officer asked, his voice sounding farther away. "No," the lieutenant managed to croak out, the word burning his throat. "It burns." It was the simplest, most honest thing he could say. He heard the crinkle of plastic, the sound of a bottle being opened. Then a cool splash of liquid hit his face. It was water. They were trying to rinse the spray from his eyes. The gesture was so normal, so medical, that it twisted the whole situation into a strange, horrible dream. The water helped a little, washing some of the oily chemical away, but the deep, penetrating burn remained as the water trickled down his neck. He heard the two officers talking to each other, their voices lower now. "Not meant for him. He's military," the younger one said. A statement of fact. "Yeah," the lead officer replied. There was a long pause. The lieutenant, still blind, could almost feel the man looking at him, really looking. Seeing the uniform, the rank insignia now dirty and wet from the pavement and the water. "You see the way he was acting?" The lead officer continued, his voice thoughtful, almost analytical. "He wasn't scared. That's what had me worried. The power dynamic. It changed." The lieutenant heard the words, and they cut through the physical pain. The power dynamic changed. It wasn't an apology. It was an analysis. A justification. He wasn't scared enough, so he had to be a threat. And now, because he was an officer in the United States Army, the power dynamic was different. The meaning was clear. If he had been just a regular person, a civilian, this would have gone differently. Worse, probably. The casual admission sent a fresh chill through him that had nothing to do with the December air. The other officer mumbled something in response. He couldn't make out. The lead officer went on, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if sharing a professional secret. If he was a regular person, this would have been a straight felony stop. Straight to the ground, guns drawn. The whole thing. The lieutenant kept his head down, listening, playing possum. His mind, trained for high-stress situations, was starting to work again through the pain. He was gathering data. This was evidence. They were confessing. The felony they were talking about was his decision to drive to a well-lit area. That was it. That was the crime that warranted a gun to his head, chemical weapons, and a threat of execution. After a few more minutes of trying to flush his eyes, the officers pulled him to his feet. He was unsteady, his legs like rubber. "We're going to take the cuffs off, okay?" the lead officer said, his voice now adopting a tone of false reassurance. "Just stand still." The metal clicked loose, and the terrible pressure on his wrists eased. He brought his arms around front, rubbing at the deep grooves the cuffs had left. His arms trembled. He still couldn't open his eyes more than a sliver, just enough to see blurred shapes and light. "Can you see anything?" the younger officer asked. "A little," he whispered. "It's blurry." The lead officer was standing right in front of him. The lieutenant could make out the dark shape of him. The man was holding something. "Look," the officer said, and his voice had changed again. It was firmer, an attempt to re-establish authority. "We're going to give you a summons. For eluding police and for obstruction." The words were like a slap. A summons? After all of this? The absurdity of it was staggering. He hadn't eluded anyone. He had signaled and driven to safety. He hadn't obstructed. He had been frozen by fear and by the sight of a pistol pointed at his face. But he said nothing. Arguing now, blind and vulnerable, would only restart the nightmare. The instinct to survive, to get out of this situation intact, was the only thing guiding him. He just nodded, a small, painful movement of his head. The officer pressed a piece of paper into his trembling hand. "You can go. You can go." Just like that. The storm was over. He was being released into the aftermath. He stood there for a moment, disbelieving. The two officers turned and walked back to their cruisers without another word. He heard car doors slam, engines start. The red and blue lights, which had been painting the gas station in pulsating color, switched off. The cruisers pulled away, their tires crunching on the gravel, and then they were gone. Silence rushed back in. The normal sounds of the night, a distant truck on the highway, the hum of the gas station sign returned. He was alone. He stood there, blinking against the burn, the crumpled summons in his hand. The cool air felt like acid on his wet skin. He was shivering, a combination of cold, shock, and adrenaline crash. He felt his way back to his SUV, his hands padding along the cold metal until he found the open door. He collapsed into the driver's seat, the door still hanging open. For a long time, he just sat there, breathing. The reality of what had just happened began to settle, not in his mind, but in his bones. In his muscles, which ached from being thrown down. In his eyes, which throbbed. In his spirit, which felt bruised in a way he had never known. He was a soldier. He knew about danger. But this was a different kind of wound. This came from home. He looked down at the green uniform, now stained with dirt and chemicals, the fabric of his service treated like a rag. He thought about the gun pointed at his face. He thought about the words, "You're fixing to ride the lightning." And he knew, with a cold certainty, that this was not over. He couldn't just go home. What had just happened in this well-lit public place was too big, too wrong, to just swallow and forget. The paper in his hand wasn't just a summons. It was a receipt for an injustice, and he was going to have to do something about it. The drive home was a blur of pain and fog. The lieutenant navigated mostly by memory, blinking hard against the relentless sting in his eyes. The world outside his windshield was just smears of light and dark. Every few minutes, a full-body shiver would run through him, a delayed reaction to the shock and the cold. He could still smell the sharp, bitter scent of the pepper spray on his uniform, on his skin. It was in his hair. It felt like it would never come out. When he finally pulled into his driveway, the familiar sight of his home didn't bring comfort. It felt like he was returning from a different world, a war zone he hadn't known existed 20 miles from his front door. He sat in the car for a long time, engine off, just listening to the silence. The quiet was different now. It felt fragile. Getting inside was a clumsy ordeal. He fumbled with his keys, his hands still unsteady. The first thing he did was stumble to the bathroom, drawn to the sink like a magnet. He splashed cold water on his face again and again, but the burning was deep, a chemical fire embedded in his pores. Milk, he'd heard somewhere. He went to the kitchen, poured some in a bowl, and soaked a towel in it, holding the cool, wet cloth to his eyes. It took the edge off, just a little, but it was the quiet moments afterward that were the hardest. Sitting on the edge of his bed, still in his stained uniform, the weight of it all started to press down. He looked at his hands. The red, raw rings around his wrists from the handcuffs were already starting to darken into bruises. He could feel the ache in his shoulders from where he'd been wrenched from the car, the tender spot on his cheek from hitting the pavement. This wasn't just about pain, though. It was about violation. A deep, personal violation. He had done everything right. He had driven to a safe place. He had kept his hands visible. He had identified himself. And none of it had mattered. The rules he lived by, the discipline he embodied in his uniform, meant nothing in that gas station. He felt stripped bare, not of his clothes, but of his dignity, his humanity, his rights. They had looked at him and seen a threat. Not a person, not a soldier, but a problem to be dominated. And then there was the fear. It was a new kind of fear, one that settled in the bones. It was the fear that next time it could be worse. The fear that the words "you're fixing to ride the lightning" weren't just an empty threat from a man losing his temper, but a glimpse into a real possibility. The fear that this could happen again, to him, or to anyone. For a few days, he moved through his life like a ghost. He went to his army post, did his job. The physical marks on his wrists were hidden by his uniform sleeves. The redness in his eyes faded, but inside he was churning. He told a few close friends, his voice flat as he recounted the facts. Their reactions disbelief, and anger validated what he already knew. This was not normal. This was not okay. But what could he do? File a complaint? He was a black man in a small town. He was a soldier. He knew about chains of command, about protocols. The idea of walking into the local police department and accusing two of their officers felt like stepping back into the gas station, alone and vulnerable all over again. Would they even believe him? It would be his word against two cops. They had the report, the summons. He had, what? A memory of terror and a ruined uniform. That's when he remembered. The cameras. The thought hit him like a bolt. The gas station. It had cameras. Of course it did. Every gas station has cameras for security. They would have seen everything. They would have seen him driving in slowly, signaling. They would have seen the officers leap out with guns drawn. They would have seen the gun pointed at his head. They would have seen him being sprayed, dragged, thrown down. It was a fragile thread of hope. He had to get that footage. But he wasn't a detective. He was just a man. He called the gas station, his heart pounding. He explained, haltingly, that he had been involved in an incident in their lot and needed to see if there was video. The manager was hesitant, wary of getting involved. The lieutenant pressed, the discipline in his voice returning. He was polite but firm. He was a lieutenant in the U.S. Army. He needed that footage as evidence. After some back and forth, the manager agreed to preserve it. He wouldn't give him a copy, but he wouldn't erase it. It was a start. Now, he needed a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but someone who understood this wasn't about a traffic ticket. This was about something much bigger. He found one, a civil rights attorney in a bigger city who listened quietly as he told his story. The lawyer didn't interrupt. When the lieutenant was done, the lawyer let out a long, slow breath. "We need to get that footage," the lawyer said. "And we need to get the body camera footage." They were wearing cameras. They have to turn them over in a lawsuit. A lawsuit. The word was huge, daunting. It meant going public. It meant fighting the police department, the town. It meant reliving the worst minutes of his life, over and over, in public. It would be expensive, stressful, and long. People would say things about him. They would try to pick apart his life, his service, looking for any reason to justify what had been done to him. He thought about just letting it go, taking the summons, maybe paying the fine, and trying to forget. The path of least resistance. He could almost taste the bitterness of that choice. It would be like surrendering. It would mean agreeing in his soul that what happened was acceptable, that he deserved it, that the next person deserved it too. He looked again at the fading bruises on his wrists. He remembered the cold feel of the pavement on his face. He remembered the officer's voice saying, the power dynamic changed. No, he couldn't let it go. This wasn't about revenge. It was about the truth. It was about making sure that what happened in that well-lit lot was seen, was known, was named for what it was. He had spent his career in service to a country built on laws. If he didn't stand up when those laws were broken so violently against him, what was that service for? He called the lawyer back. "Let's do it," he said, his voice quiet but clear for the first time in days. "Let's get the footage." He was no longer just a victim in a gas station. He was becoming a plaintiff. The fight was just beginning, and he knew it would be the hardest mission of his life. But for the first time since that night, he didn't feel helpless. He had an objective. He had evidence to gather, and he had the truth on his side. Now, he had to make the world see it. The lawsuit was filed quietly in a federal court. It was a dry document, full of legal language, but at its heart, it told a simple, powerful story. A man, a soldier, had his rights violated in a terrifying and brutal way. The town, the police department, and the two officers were now officially put on notice. The fight had moved from the pavement of a gas station to the halls of the justice system. For months, very little seemed to happen. There were letters from lawyers, requests for information, delays. It was a slow, grinding process. The lieutenant went about his army duties, but a part of him was always waiting, always on edge. He wondered if anything would ever come of it. He wondered if the system was just designed to tire people like him out, to make them give up and go away. Then his lawyer called. The body camera footage had been obtained. "You need to be ready," the lawyer told him, his voice serious. "When this gets out, people are going to see it." It's going to be? It's very hard to watch. The lieutenant knew that. He lived it. But seeing it from the outside was a different kind of pain. When he finally saw the clips, edited together from both officers' cameras, it was like being pulled back into that night. There he was, hands on the wheel, voice calm. There was the gun, pointed right at his face, his own blurred figure behind the window. There was the spray, his cry of pain, the violent pull from the car. And there were the words, clear as day. "You're fixing to ride the lightning." Watching it, he felt the same cold fear, the same humiliation. But he also felt a strange detachment. That man on the ground, being kicked and cursed, that was him, and yet seeing it made it real in a new way. This wasn't just his memory anymore. It was a record dot. His legal team made the decision to release the footage to the public. They knew its power. On a morning in April, almost 4 months after the gas station stop, the video was published online. Alongside the court documents, the world reacted almost instantly. It was as if a match had been tossed into dry grass. The video spread faster than anyone could have imagined. News stations picked it up. It played on cable news, the horrifying scene on a loop. Social media exploded. People were outraged, disgusted, heartbroken. For many, it was a visual confirmation of stories they had only heard about. For others, it was a shocking revelation. The image of a U.S. Army officer in uniform being treated with such cruelty during a traffic stop broke through the usual noise. Comment sections filled with anger. Demands for accountability grew louder by the hour. The lieutenant watched the reaction from a distance. He didn't give many interviews at first. The video, he believed, spoke for itself. He saw the support pouring in from strangers, from fellow soldiers, from veterans groups. He also saw the ugly comments, the people trying to blame him, saying he should have just obeyed faster, that he must have done something to deserve it. Those hurt, but they didn't surprise him. They were part of the same sickness that had caused the incident in the first place. The pressure on the small town of Windsor became immense. The phone at the police department and the town hall rang off the hook. National news vans parked on their quiet streets. The town's leaders were suddenly in a glaring spotlight they never asked for and didn't know how to handle. Inside the police department, an internal investigation had been chugging along slowly. Now it was thrust into overdrive. The Virginia State Police also announced they were launching an independent investigation. There was no more time for delays. The world was watching. The internal investigators pored over the footage. They interviewed the two officers. They read the lawsuit. They compared the officer's report, which claimed the lieutenant was eluding and aggressive, with the cold, visual evidence of the cameras. The disconnect was staggering. The report was a story of a dangerous suspect. The video was the story of a calm man being terrorized. The focus zeroed in on the lead officer, the one with the gun, the spray, and the words. His actions were impossible to defend. Pointing a gun at a man who was complying. Using pepper spray when there was no physical threat. Making a statement about execution. Each of these was a direct violation of multiple police policies on use of force, de-escalation, and professional conduct. The decision, when it came, was swift. The town announced that the officer was terminated. He was fired. His badge, his gun, his career with the Windsor Police Department were over, forfeited as a direct result of his actions that December night. The official statement cited a clear breach of department policies and ethics. The other officer, who had been present but was seen more as a follower in the footage, received disciplinary action but remained on the force. For the lieutenant, the news brought a complex flood of feelings. There was no cheering, no celebration. How could you celebrate the bare minimum of accountability? A man had lost his job, but the lieutenant still carried the scars. The visible ones on his wrists had faded, but the deeper ones had not. The fear in the pit of his stomach, when he saw police lights in his mirror, now was a new, permanent resident. The lawsuit continued. Eventually, the town, wanting to make the story go away, agreed to a settlement. They would pay him a sum of money. It wasn't an enormous amount, not for what he had endured. In the grand scheme of things, it was a modest figure. But for him, the money was never the point. He hadn't sued to get rich. He had sued for someone to say, officially and on the record, that what happened was wrong. The firing of the officer was that statement. The settlement was just the period at the end of the sentence. Part of the settlement also required the town to mandate additional, proper training for all of its officers on de-escalation and bias. It was a small step toward trying to prevent the next person from going through what he did. The news cycles moved on. The national headlines faded. The story became a footnote, a viral video people vaguely remembered. But for the man at the center of it, life was forever changed. He had stood up, not with a weapon, but with the truth and the law. He had forced a town to look at itself, and in doing so, he had given others a piece of evidence in a much larger, Ongoing struggle. He still serves his country. He still wears the uniform. But he wears it with a new understanding of the battles that can happen at home, in a well-lit place, on an ordinary road. He knows his fight was just one incident. The officer who lost his job was just one man. The problem is bigger than any single person. But for him, there was a kind of peace in knowing he didn't just lie down and take it. He used the very system that had failed him to demand a price for that failure. He had gone into that gas station a soldier. He came out a victim. But through a long, hard fight, he had become something else. A witness who refused to be silent. And in the end, that was what made the difference.